All right, we are now live. Thank you all for joining us today for our presentation of Fay Sudow and her unsolved murder, presented by the lovely Kim Schutte, the City Historic Preservation Planner for St. Joseph. Kim, I will go ahead and let you take over. Before we get started, we'll have everybody muted, and I'm going to shut your videos off just so we can see the screen a little easier that way. But at the end, there will be a Q&A session where feel free to put your video and unmute yourself to ask those questions definitely at the end. We are also on Facebook Live, so if you're joining us on Facebook, feel free to just comment those questions and I'll be able to read them to Kim and get those answered for you.
Okay, well, thank you, Sarah. As Sarah said, I'm the Historic Preservation Planner for the City of St. Joseph. And among other jobs, I've been tasked with putting together a history of the Eastern European immigrant community of St. Joseph. And so I started doing the research for that. And part of that was just trying to track down names of people who the Eastern European immigrants were, some demographic data. And I'd come across the name Julius Levi, and I was looking him up, and I was on Find a Grave, which is one of my favorite sites. And if you haven't played on it, I highly recommend it. And when I had him up, sometimes Find a Grave tells you who their children are. And on his Find a Grave, there was this picture of Fay Sudow, and it's the picture that's up on the screen now. And it looked interesting. She didn't die in St. Joseph, so I didn't think she'd be anything I was all that interested in, but I clicked on it. And all of a sudden, I am into this rabbit hole of this unsolved murder, St. Joe connections, dark double lives, all this kind of thing. So it was great fun. And so what I'm going to tell you today is kind of the story of the unsolved murder of Fay Sudow. So the last time anybody saw 42-year-old Fay Sudow alive was on December 10th, 1920. 2 days later, her nude, mutilated body was discovered in a eucalyptus grove outside of Los Angeles. As the details about the condition of her body and the curious double life that she led emerged, the case became a cause célèbre across the nation. Newspapers all over the country carried the story. I mean, it was huge news. And the interest was fueled and really got intense as the police failed to find the murderer. They couldn't solve the murder. They had no clear motive, all of these things. So it led to speculation. And as late as 10 years later, in 1930, the Los Angeles Police Department referred to it as, quote, the perfect crime. And it still was of enough interest to have front page retrospective on the Los Angeles Evening Express. Now, Fay Sudow was born, actually, Pauline Levi in Russia, or Poland, which was controlled by Russia at the time. Her parents were Julius and Emma Bloch Levi. The family emigrated to the United States in 1882 when their daughter, Pauline, who was the oldest of their children, was 4. Now, the Levis were part of a mass migration of Jewish people out of Eastern Europe at that time due to anti-Semitic government policies on the part of Russia. The assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881 was blamed on the Jewish community and triggered a series of pogroms or mass violence against the Jewish community that began in the Ukraine and spread across southern Russia. In 1882, Tsar Alexander III put in place a collection of anti-Semitic laws known collectively as May laws. These regulated where Jewish citizens could live, prohibited non-Jewish citizens or Gentiles from issuing mortgages to members of the Jewish community, and prohibited Jewish businesses from operating on Sundays. Jewish people from Russia and other Eastern European countries began to emigrate in mass numbers to the United States in the wake of those laws. According to the American Jewish Yearbook, between 1881 and 1910, more than 1.5 million Jewish people came to the United States, and more than 70% of those came from Russia. And among those were the Levi family. The Levis soon came to St. Joseph, where Julius opened a general merchandise store at which he was moderately successful. He did fine. As I said, Julius and his wife Emma were born in Russia, or more specifically today we would call it Poland, but it was controlled by Russia at the time. They married in 1876 when they were in their early to mid-20s. Julius came to the United States in 1881, and he was followed the next year by Emma and their daughter Pauline. Julius opened a small general merchandise store at 1213 North 3rd Street here in St. Joseph, while the family lived at a duplex at 1209, 1211 North 3rd. And the pictures up here, you can see the neighborhood as it exists today. That's Ruby Doo Row, so that kind of grounds you where we are. And the duplex and the general store would have been here and largely taken out when the highway went in. So it's that part of town. The family had at least 5 daughters and 1 son. And there are hints that Emma, the mother, might have been quite a character. In 1905, a local citizen, a local woman named Winifred Skinnard, sued the Levis for $1,500, which was a lot of money at the time, alleging that, quote, Emma Levi did seize her on a public street of St. Joseph and forcibly detained her, stripped her of her cloak, searching her in view of many passerby, greatly humiliating her. It seems that Emma thought that Winifred had stolen from the store. Was not able to find in the records how the case came out, but they seem to have been a colorful family. Now, nothing in any of the reports about the murder makes mention that Fay's birth name was Pauline, but the census records for the Levis here in town indicate that their oldest daughter was Pauline, and her birth date corresponds with what is given for Fay, and none of the census records list a Fay. And there's no mention at all in any of the records of a Fay Levi ever living in St. Joseph. The only mention of Pauline Levi in the St. Joseph Press before the murder was from the St. Joseph Herald in May 1896 with a report about her 18th birthday, and that's the article there, and it lists all of her guests and everything. Now, 3 of Fay's sisters, Sylvia, Helen, and Dora, grew up here, married in St. Joseph, and remained here for their lives. Sylvia married Abe Einbender, and together they opened Einbender's store, which is very famous. Helen married a gentleman by the last name of Fine. I have not been able to find his first name. And Dora married Herman Boardman. And she's an interesting case in her own right. She divorced Herman in 1923 on grounds of desertion. And so, again, the family seems to have been kind of interesting. Another sister, Sarah, married a man with the last name of Tizer and moved to Rochester, New York. And their brother Joseph remained in St. Joseph and continued the family business for a while. Now, according to the records, most of the children worked in their family store. And some of them made entire careers of it. For example, the son. Pauline seems to have had bigger dreams than that. I find her once in 1900 listed as working for her father's store, but after that she drops off here in St. Joseph. She left St. Joseph to go to New York when she was quite young. The life in the big city was not easy. She went to work in one of the garment sweatshops that were so common in the Lower East Side. At the time she moved there, the Lower East Side of New York was known as, quote, the world's largest Jewish city. The Lower East Side of New York had been the center of the garment trade in the United States since before 1850. And this picture shows the kind of conditions that Pauline would have been working in when she was there. Now, at about age 23, she met a man named Bernard Sudow, who was a clerk in a business in the area. They had a common background. Both of them had been born in Jewish-controlled Poland and come to the United States as children. And at some point, while she's in New York, she seems to have dropped the name Pauline and began to use the name Fay. And she has, by all accounts, very little contact with her St. Joseph family. Now, in 1903, she moved to Los Angeles and at some point there reconnected with Bernard. They married and in 1904 had their only child, a daughter named Lucille. According to the Los Angeles Evening Express at the time of the murder, they said, quote, almost with the birth of her child, Mrs. Sudow dropped a curtain of mystery over her life. a veil which the best detectives have never been able to penetrate. That's the end of the quote. Her apparent determination to keep her life a mystery added to the intrigue and the interest when the murder was known. Though initially the Sudows were very poor, Fay apparently had a strong business acumen, maybe inherited from her father, and she accumulated a significant amount of money. At the time of her murder, everyone around her denied any knowledge of the source of her funds. They couldn't figure out how she had gotten quite so rich. Very quickly after moving to Los Angeles and the birth of their daughter, Fay and Bernard began to live apart from one another, and their daughter Lucille initially lived with her father in a small cottage in the southwest section of Los Angeles. As she got a bit older, she was then sent to boarding school. Fay visited the family home, but she never stayed for long. And Bernard stated, he said, "I never knew such a nature as she had. We came west to see if we could better our fortunes, but I did not have very good luck. One day she said to me that she was tired of being mixed up with a failure. 'I'm going to get out,' she said to me, 'and you just watch when I am gone. I'll show you how to make real money.'" She seems to have also at this point gone on frequent and extended road trips, but again, people around her said they don't know where she went or what she was doing. After leaving the family home, Fay became involved in the real estate market. She seems to have decided that was the way that she was going to make her money. She designed and owned some of the most attractive and popular apartments and bungalow courts in the Los Angeles area. Bungalow court refers to a style of multifamily housing in which several small houses surround a small central garden. From 1910 to 1930, this was the primary multifamily residential type in Southern California. Fay's business was conducted through a man named William Jones, who was a reputable and well-known real estate man. Jones said of her, "She might have been called architect as well as builder and owner. Every detail of her ventures, every feature of architecturing, every factor of landscape effect which combined to make her Los Angeles holdings model bungalow courts originated in her brain." Now, during this period, her contact with her family in St. Joseph was apparently very minimal. Although on July 10, 1909, the St. Joseph News Press reported that her sister Sarah had gone to Los Angeles to spend 2 months with her sister Fay. Now, on the last day of her life, Fay was on her way to meet with her business agent, William Jones, and that's where she was headed when she disappeared. She had an appointment to meet with him on the afternoon of December 10th at his office in the Central Building at 6th and Main. Earlier that day, she had contacted George Goodrich, a plumber, and asked him to do some work at one of her bungalow courts. By chance, she met Goodrich at the entrance to the Central Building, and she remarked to him that she had an appointment there. Goodrich went on down the street about his business, assuming that Fay entered the building and went on to her appointment, but she never made it to her appointment. 2 days later, on December 12, 1920, John Hudson and his wife were hiking through the area of Los Angeles known as Edendale Hills when they made the gruesome discovery of Fay's body buried under the leaves and brush in the eucalyptus grove. She had been beaten to death and then a razor used to mutilate her face. The body was stripped naked when it was found. The newspapers were full of gory details. The Los Angeles Times on December 14th reported, very exaggerated, but they said, "W.M. Strother, member of the undertaking firm now holding the body, stated last night that there is no doubt in his mind that the mutilation of the face was committed with a knife for the purpose of removing features by which the body could be identified. Closer inspection of the body showed that the skull was penetrated in more than a dozen places. Some of the perforations are 1/4 of an inch wide and up to 6 inches in length. These wounds," Mr. Strother said, "were inflicted with a heavy metal instrument, which may have been a hatchet. The assailant probably stood directly above his victim as she lay prone and helpless at his feet and hacked away at her with all his might. The nature of the blows and the different directions from which they were struck indicated." As I said, this is probably quite exaggerated. There's no indication that a hatchet was used or anything, but if you think about the Lizzie Borden case, it's a very powerful image, and the newspapers at that time did love really exaggerating things. But exaggerated or not, this was a serious murder. unknown woman at that time was found mutilated. And so the Los Angeles Police Department, of course, became involved. The two detectives who were assigned to the case were Dwight Longovan and H.F. McCarran. This is Dwight Longovan. He's this one as well. And this is Mr. McCarran. The two were fairly newly made detective sergeants, so they weren't real senior. Now, they brought in Bernard Sudow to identify the body. He's who identified her. And soon after the identification of the body, the detectives found and opened her safe deposit box, hoping it would provide some insight into her life and thus into her murder. But the documents inside were not helpful. They were just very minor business type of things. And they did not succeed in finding a will that they believed had been drafted, making her 16-year-old daughter, Lucille, her sole heir. Her attorney said that there was that will, but they couldn't find it. On December 18th, the Los Angeles Evening Express stated, 4 men, each of whom is apparently able to furnish a perfect alibi, are being investigated as slayer suspects. Police detectives frankly admit their failure to establish a motive for the crime or develop a lead unequivocally pointing to the identity of the murderer. Now, not surprisingly, early in the investigation, the police focused on her estranged husband, Bernard, as the prime suspect. He's the one who identified the body, and he was the first person they questioned. Under questioning, Bernard stated that he had filed for divorce from Fay in April of that year, and that Fay had then gone away with a man named Harold Walter Weller, a painter whom she had met while he was doing some work on one of her apartment buildings. Sudow stated that Fay and Weller had left Los Angeles on June 16th, traveling by car along the coast to Canada, and had made stops in Chicago and had gone on to El Paso. And that's kind of an odd circuitous route, but nevertheless. Fay then left Weller in El Paso with the car and $75, and she returned by train to Los Angeles. She met up with Bernard then in November of 1920, and according to him, the couple agreed to reconcile. And he stated that he was planning to withdraw the divorce action when she was found dead. Now, Sudow's story of imminent reconciliation was complicated by the testimony of L.W. Phillip, a health department clerk, who said that he saw the couple engaged in a fist fight on December 6th. Sudow denied this. A motorist later testified that on December 7th, he had given the couple a ride to Edendale Hills, which is where her body was found. And again, Sudow denied that. The police tracked Weller down to Tucson, Arizona to see if maybe he was the killer, but he had a firm alibi. He did return to Los Angeles to answer questions, and he stated that he and Fay had intended to marry once her divorce was final, thus calling into question again Sudow's idea of an imminent reconciliation. Investigation into the relationship between Weller and Fay found that the two had shared an apartment, that Fay paid the rent, and according to the landlord, they fought frequently and violently. As the investigation got underway, the curious life led by Fay Levi Sudow began to emerge. At the time of her death, she was worth in 1920 dollars, $198,542. In today's money, that is $2,692,229.52. So she was very, very wealthy. Despite her great wealth, her personal appearance tended toward the slovenly. She frequently wore old, tattered clothing. She wasn't quite clean. She looked very poor. She lived in squalid circumstances. The few places they could find where she lived, the apartments were in the poorest, worst part of town, very poorly furnished, not clean. And by contrast, her business life put her in contact with many of the most respectable and wealthy people in Los Angeles. But she spent her evenings sort of in the dark underbelly of the city with poverty-stricken, disreputable people. This is the height of Prohibition, and she spent a lot of time at nightclubs, drinking, that kind of thing. So she had this kind of double life, and that, of course, people found very intriguing. One of the big mysteries surrounding Fay at the time of her death was her address. Nobody seemed to know where she lived. She spent time in cheap apartments and rooming houses, frequently in the company of various men. Her mail always went to general delivery, and never in her own name. She used Helen Levi and Irene Craig for her mailing names. Now, soon after the discovery of her body, her attorney spoke of her saying, "She was one of the most shrewd and industrious women I ever saw. She came to us about 10 years ago to secure legal aid in her business transactions. Her property was heavily mortgaged, sometimes more than it was worth. Taking hold of property like a shoestring, Mrs. Sudow would pull it through and make something of it. I believe her income totaled about $2,400 a month from a principal of $100,000. And just by the way, $2,400 a month in 1920 is $32,500 a month in our money. So again, she was very wealthy. A few years ago, the attorney said, a few years ago, we learned that she was living in a dingy room on South Figueroa Street. It was shabbily furnished with just a cot and bare furnishings. She was known to be in this place only a few hours of the night. I don't believe she carried more than 50 cents in her pocket at any one time. Shabbily dressed, she acted like a pauper and seemed to want people to know her as a pauper." So as the investigation progressed, it became clear that Fay preferred to spend her evenings in the bars and the dance halls and kind of, as I said, the dark underbelly of Los Angeles at the time. A lot of it in the really rough parts of the city. A paper from Hinton, West Virginia, and as I said, this case was covered all over the nation, but this newspaper from Hinton, West Virginia reported, and they said, "By day, the woman dressed as other businesswomen dress, quietly and conservatively. By night, she adorned herself in costly gowns and jewels and then launched into a nightlife of wild debauch, accompanied by men and women with whom she had no contact during the day." And again, that's kind of an exaggeration, but it gives you an idea of the double life that people thought she was living. And this mysterious double life led police to believe that she was involved in the narcotics trade. Because the crime was never solved, we don't know why Fay was killed. Los Angeles Police Department always thought that it had to do with the drug trade, that she was involved in drug trafficking. And this theory actually began early in the investigation with the testimony of a woman named Irene Berger. She was the wife of a petty officer in the Navy who confessed to being a narcotics user. Now, Irene claimed that in the period between Fay's disappearance on December 10th and the discovery of the body on December 12th, that Fay had been held prisoner by a gang of narcotics dealers. Irene said that Fay had been taken to an isolated place in Griffith Park by 3 members of the gang who beat her to death, believing her to be a police informant. Now, the police were not convinced by the story. There was no evidence for it, but in the absence of any other good leads, they investigated it for several days. As that investigation was going forward, a 74-year-old Pasadena gardener named L.D. Tipton came forward with his own salacious story. He stated that Fay had appeared at his door about 3 weeks before her death, telling him that she was being pursued by a band of criminals. She begged him to let her sleep on a pile of rags in his garage, but she refused to tell him more details about what was going on, and so he wouldn't let her sleep in his garage, and so she left. And again, there's no evidence that that's true, but the police follow it up because they don't have anything else. The press began to speculate that she used her real estate dealings as a front for drug smuggling or rum running. And again, we're in Prohibition, so that would have been lucrative as well. But again, there's no evidence of any of this. Now, as the investigation progressed and they got nowhere looking at her life in Los Angeles, the press at least began to look at her life outside of Los Angeles, looking back to her hometown. And you start to see reports. And again, one of the newspapers says, stories, unverified, have come from St. Joseph, Missouri, Mrs. Sudow's girlhood home. They whispered of a millionaire banker in Kansas City who had been blackmailed over a period of many years. The man was questioned. He admitted that he knew the slain woman in years gone by, but he denied in detail the whispers which linked his name with hers. And again, we have no evidence of any of this, no idea who that man could be or anything like that. But the press is trying to fill in the gap where any evidence is. Now in St. Joseph, the news press first reported the story on December 20th, 1920. Now, despite her local connections, the details in the story are less than precise. Local press began reporting that Fay and Bernard had gotten married here in St. Joseph, that they lived here for several years before moving on to Los Angeles. There's nothing in the local records to indicate that. It doesn't fit with the timeline of their lives. One of the press reports says that, quote, her parents said that they may send someone to Los Angeles to investigate the murder. Abraham Einbender, a brother-in-law of the murdered woman, sent a telegram to the chief of police at Los Angeles Sunday night, but had received no reply. And Einbender was married to Fay's younger sister, Sylvia. The news press of this goes on to state that Einbender intended to travel to Los Angeles on December 21st to investigate the death. We've got, again, no indication that he actually did go. Now, the St. Joseph newspapers were not slow to focus on the salacious part of the story. They liked an exaggerated headline as much as anybody else. So on January 7th, 1921, the news press ran a story with the headline, Los Angeles dispatches say Mrs. Fay Sudow was victim of a gang of narcotics peddlers. According to a dispatch from Los Angeles, Mrs. Fay Sudow was murdered by a gang of narcotic peddlers operating along the Pacific coast. Mrs. Sudow's nude and mutilated body was found in the hills near Los Angeles. The reason for the killing is not known. Mrs. Sudow is spoken of as the wealthy woman of mystery. Now, these salacious and mysterious elements to the story made this a national sensation for several months. And this was fueled by one particular story that was published in several newspapers. And it was called The Astounding Double Life of the Woman Who Has Paid the Price. And it was written by a man named Frank Dallum. And the story is filled with exciting illustrations, language that is really reminiscent of the popular crime novels of the time. It's very exaggerated. It purports to tell the story of her quote unquote Jekyll and Hyde existence, all that kind of thing. Now, it told the basic outlines of the case as they were known in January of 1921, but it was full of absolute exaggerations. So, for example, it doubled how much she was worth. It overemphasized her time in the nightclubs, those kinds of things. But it was designed to sell newspapers. And as I said, you can find this exact story in multiple newspapers all across the nation. Well, the investigation went nowhere. But as it was going, they had to bury Fay. Fay was buried at Home of Peace Memorial Park in Los Angeles, and that's the oldest Jewish cemetery in the Los Angeles area. Now, after she's buried and the investigation's going forward, one of the big issues that had to be resolved was where would the daughter live? Where would Lucille live? At the time of her murder, she was in boarding school. Her mother seems to have been making a decided effort to keep her life separate from her daughter's life. Initially, Bernard indicated that he would seek custody of his daughter, but early press speculation was that he would not have much success. There were some people who thought that she would be sent to St. Joseph to live with her maternal grandparents, but that didn't happen. And in the end, based on the Los Angeles city directories, it does appear that Lucille did go live with her father. She seems to have remained in Los Angeles her entire life. She married someone by the last name of Desmond and died in 1993. So Lucille's was around for a long time. Bernard remained in Los Angeles as well. He died on December 22nd, 1957, never having remarried. And he was buried at the Hollywood Memorial Park Cemetery, now known as Hollywood Forever Cemetery. Now, following Fay's murder, her family in St. Joseph kind of continues on, of course, with their lives. Her mother, Emma, died in 1923 as a result of a diabetic coma. Julius died in 1932. And his obituary, where they list children and all of that, make no mention of Fay or Pauline. It's just as if the oldest child had never been. Sylvia Einbender's husband, Abraham, they opened a successful St. Joseph women's clothing store, as you know. It started actually as a grocery, and Sylvia had the idea of adding women's clothing, and the famous Einbenders was born. Abe died in 1959, and Sylvia died in 1989. And Sylvia's obituary also does not mention her older sister. Dora Boardman, another sister, died in 1971. She had also gone out to California. She died in Hollywood. Sarah Tizer died in 1977 in Houston, Texas, after living in St. Joseph with Sylvia for many years. The brother Joseph remained in St. Joseph, running the family business until his death, and he died in 1967. And the St. Joseph part of the family are buried at Sher Shalom. After the 10-year anniversary of the murder in 1930, the press covered that, and you have this, the headlines and kind of the retrospective. The case fell out of the public eye. It remains unsolved, and so it still is kind of one of those interesting mysteries that are associated with St. Joe history. And that's the end of the unsolved murder of Fay Sudow.
Thank you, Kim.
You're welcome.
I had absolutely no idea of any part of that story, so that was fascinating for me to sit down and listen to.
It came as a surprise to me too.
Right? Who knew? And so much of it is still like we don't know anything about this woman. Are there any questions from anyone here on Zoom? Feel free to unmute yourself. You should find that in the bottom left part of your screen. You can certainly do that, or feel free to type it out in the chat. We can do it that way. I'll check Facebook here real quick, see if we have any comments or questions from there.
I have a question for Kim.
Yeah, Jackie.
How did you get interested in this? I missed the very beginning of the program, so you may have said that. But
I did, but I will again. As part of what I'm doing for the city, when we tear down things using federal funds, we have to mitigate that loss. And we're tearing down a few buildings in Padytown. And part of that mitigation, I am doing a study of the Eastern European immigrant population of St. Joseph. And I was identifying these people, and I came across her father, and I was trying to flesh out him, and was on Find a Grave. And it had a picture of her, as his daughter. And I just was curious. There was no reason for me to have clicked on it. It had a little picture of her, but there was no indication that there was anything interesting there, but I clicked. And all of a sudden, as I said, it was the rest of my day. I mean, I was down the rabbit hole. It was like, this is the coolest thing. It's like the Black Dahlia murder and things, and that it had the St. Joe connection. And then it was a lot later that I figured out that the Einbender connection was actually Einbenders. There were a lot of Einbenders at the time. And so it was kind of late into the research. And I was here at the office when I made that, and I go running out into the main part of the office where my colleagues are, and there's some of the older ladies there. And it's like, guess what? Sylvia Einbender's sister, was murdered. And I've not yet come across anybody who knew the story. And the family seems to have tried to kind of cover it up. As I said, none of the obits or anything list anything about her. It's like, they didn't want to talk about it.
Well, it sure is an interesting story. I'm glad you looked that up and are sharing it with us.
Yeah, I thought it was kind of fun in its own way.
All right. I didn't see any from our Facebook watch either. So unless anybody has other questions for Kim here, I think that just about wraps up our program.
All right. Terrific. Well, thank you.
Thank you for sharing with us. Hopefully we'll be able to do another one soon. I know that you've done a lot of research on those immigrant stories.
And there's some really fascinating, they don't all involve mutilated dead bodies. So yeah, St. Joe has a lot of history, and it isn't all Pony Express and Joe Ruby do. There's a lot of other things. So.
Well, thank you, Kim. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. You can find our future events here on Facebook, and also at our website is www.st Joseph spelled out, and museumspelledout.org for future events like this one. Thank you all.